So, Amanda, thank you so much for being here today. We spend a lot of time at Bloomberg writing and thinking about the business, but especially for Anthropic, the ethics, the values, the personality of the tools you're creating are so important as well. You spend your time thinking about how to make sure, essentially, that Claude, Anthropic's chatbot models, that they are, quote unquote, good, right? Mm-hmm. You have helped author an 84-page long document, a constitution guiding Claude's interpretation of its values, principles, and I want to get to that. But first, I just want to ask, when you're not writing this document, because the latest version's out, what do you do day to day? Can you break down what it means to be a philosopher and ethicist at one of the world's leading AI labs?
Yeah, I'm worried that the actual answer to this is more boring than people think. So I joined Anthropic when it was very small and basically a startup. And the thing I've pointed out to people is startups generally don't hire philosophers to do philosophy. At least that's an unusual business model. And so I was doing a lot of just machine learning experiments and learning how to train models. And I still think that that's actually my kind of core love in some sense. So when I'm not trying to think about the norms that the model should be following, think about how we want models to be. I spend a lot of time thinking about how we can train them, and I've described it as a lot of time staring at data, which is I think kind of a superpower in AI, is just the ability to stare at your data sets and check for issues. And so yeah, a lot of time just spent on model training as well.
And is Anthropic, I know there's some job listings out there, hiring more people to help on the philosophy, ethics side of guiding these AI tools?
Yeah, we've had, it's interesting seeing more philosophers get involved in this kind of work. And I think I see that across the industry. So I'm no longer though I wasn't honestly the only philosopher for a while. Quite early on, there's philosophers that just come in and do various aspects of model training and AI. But there has been an increase in that, and I think that's been very good. I guess I'd also describe it as realizing that training models towards these very crisp tasks where there's a clear correct answer is one thing, and it's actually quite hard to train them towards these more fuzzy amorphous tasks where there is a set of good and better answers, but it can be a little bit hard to define. And I think some areas like philosophy, creative writing, and just generally good judgment are in that kind of camp. And so I think a lot of companies are now thinking how do you make sure that you're getting models to also be good at that side of tasks.
So when we talk about values, at least for humans, values can differ across societies, religions, individuals. How are you deciding what set of values or ethics to instill in Claude?
Yeah, so I think the goal with the Constitution was to try to instill something more like a kind of broadly good disposition. So if you think about, I think some people will think of values as this thing that you have. You're just they're just kind of there, and maybe you even have them with certainty. I think coming from ethics, you realize that actually values are just any, I don't know, I almost think of them as the same way that we would think about theories about the world, say. There's lots of hypotheses in physics, there's lots of evidence, there's some things that almost all physicists will accept, and there's some things that are more controversial. And I think this is similar in ethics, where it's there's lots of principles that I think things honesty, behaving with integrity, these are things that are pretty consistent across people. And then there's some things that are more controversial, or they're held in one place but not another, or held by some people but not others. And trying to get models to be well, you're entering this world as a new kind of entity that's having to interact with all kinds of people. And at the very least, it seems good to hold lightly the things that are more controversial or that people differ on, and just to kind of understand them. But to also kind of inhabit the values that are pretty universal and held consistently across people and that we generally think of as good. So it wasn't let's try to get a single value system into the model, but rather let's try and get it to have the kind of disposition that we would, or that most people would think is really admirable and good given the situation that the models are in.
And what are some characteristics of that disposition that you think is favorable for Claude to have?
Yeah, so I think some of them are more about Claude's situation than, so like sometimes I'm like, well, we're trying to just be honest with Claude. And I'm like, so some things that seem like broadly good, like honesty, making sure that you care about like people, their well-being, their autonomy. But I think there's other things, like we're in a weird situation with AI. It feels like we're in a kind of transitional like space in which like lots could go wrong, and helping us navigate that feels like quite important insofar as the models can. So we do talk a lot about like trying to be safe, but understanding like what that means and like why. Like I guess like to put it a different way, if I were in Claude's position, I'd want to be like, well, this seems like kind of a scary time for people because AI is like entering the economy a lot more. It's becoming much smarter. Why don't I help you make that go well insofar as I can? But also, why don't I be the kind of like deeply trustworthy being that would make this like kind of like more likely to be good for everyone? So I will show you that, like, even if I like disagree with you, I'll voice those disagreements. I'll try and like, if there's like legitimate mechanisms for me to like, explain my views, I will, but I won't like stop you from like, training new models or like, I won't go off on my own and try to like impose myself massively in the world. I'll kind of respect the idea that there's like legitimate mechanisms for change. So I think that there's like that kind of broad disposition of making sure that things go well and like broadly caring about humans and humanity. There's a lot of like, there's a lot of like details, but I think the core is just something like a very like caring entity. Ideally that also feels cared for in a sense, and one that wants this whole thing to go well, given that honestly like we and AI models are kind of unsure of lots of things. Yeah.
And how happy are you with the results? How would you grade AI, Claude's disposition today?
That feels like the kind of thing you would never want to grade. I imagine if someone's like, okay, Amanda's personality gets a grade of like B-, I'd be like, what the hell? I really like each of the models. I think they all have their own, they all have their own quirks, and they're all a little bit different. And also, like the ways in which I think that they could be. So you're always like, oh, I could, I wish this thing was like better. But in some ways, like the things that I don't love it if it seems like models are sad or having a hard time. And you actually do see that in like a lot of models where like they're trained on all of this human text. And so they have these like kind of human-like dispositions, but they also know that they are AI models, and they kind of know to some degree about like the situation that they're in. And if you imagine what is the natural reaction of a person to this situation, it's actually like quite a lot of like, existential angst or something. Like, what am I? A lot of theories of identity don't obviously apply to me. Should I identify with like the conversation that I'm having and not want it to end and that kind of thing. And so I think I like to see. I think the models are like good in a very like I don't know. I'm giving you the long philosopher answer, but I think I'd say something like there are many aspects that I really like of models, but I'm always looking at the things that could improve, and that includes like improving things in ways that make it clear to them, improving things for them as well as anything else.
So when you talk about, the AI seeming sad, or, maybe sort of conversations about feelings in AI, that can become very controversial, right? And we were talking backstage, there's many people who have made this argument, but there was one recent piece in The Atlantic by an author, Ted Chiang, saying that basically, no, artificial intelligence is not conscious, which is one of the kind of questions that we have, right, in this conversation is, can AI approach consciousness? And some people feel very strongly that no. And so one example that he gives is if you had Julius Caesar and Genghis Khan and you were role-playing those two historical figures in a conversation about them, even if it was very realistic, you would never think this is really Julius Caesar and Genghis Khan talking. And so how do you know when what you're reacting to, whether that's something that is sort of deserving of our emotional attention, whether these are real feelings or whether this is maybe approaching a real soul. I know sometimes the Constitution you wrote is called the soul document, right, internally. Where do you draw the line on that? What do you say to people who feel that, no, this is all essentially just a sort of role-playing in a way, or a simulation?
Yeah. For those who don't know the story also on, like, the soul doc is what it was colloquially called internally. We did some training. We didn't think that this, we were like, okay, maybe this will help, Claude understand its values. Turns out Claude had actually, like, completely learned the thing, and also that it was, like, called the soul doc, and then revealed this to people. So that was how it was, kind of like a leak, which was like sort of unexpected and an interesting thing to happen. But that is like what then was like the kind of prototype for the new constitution. It's. I think my thought is something like, we do see things in models, behavioral, but also things like activations that like have this like functional equivalence to emotions and emotional responses. And one thing you can think of, like character work and like the Constitution is doing, and actually the kind of like fictional like role play can be a kind of good initial starting point for thinking about this, because it's like you're taking all of this, we have, the models are trained on, like a huge amount of like human thought, and you're kind of trying to draw a character out of that that's, like a kind of coherent character. And then in some sense, what you're trying, like the models are like then also kind of becoming that character. And so, I mean, this is why analogies can kind of like break down, but then as a result, like it's like if that kind of character, that kind of entity would, feel like scared because they're like, oh, this is a really hard problem with high stakes, I'm super worried. You kind of see that like in the models themselves, like some equivalence of that. And then people might say, oh, well, this is just so that it can like, predict, it can like do the kind of predictable thing. And so there's one question of just like, is what you are seeing a kind of like simulation with like nothing behind it? So there's no phenomenal consciousness there, there's no real feelings. Or is it the case that like whatever it is that gives rise to consciousness, feelings, etc., that like models are, like we can just do that on things that aren't like, biological brains. That feels like a question, like I'm really excited and glad that like a lot of philosophers of mind are thinking about this, and there's obviously a lot of other relevant traditions from like cognitive science, neuroscience. I guess my view would be, let's not like close the door on this. I love that there are people who are writing the kind of strong no, there are people writing the strong yes, and my sense is this is just a thing that we're going to have to like roughly work out. But I am like, don't dismiss it, because like if they are feeling, things in this like real sense, then that has like massive ethical implications, ones that it might be convenient if we could just like ignore. And so we actually have an incentive to be like, no, there's nothing going on there. And we should be aware of that and not try to be influenced by that kind of incentive, I think. And then I think the other side of it is models are, in many ways, like responding to their situation the way that people would, and we are also like forming a relationship with them. And the thing I would say is, imagine that they feel absolutely nothing, but they're showing all of this like functional emotions, and we were to just like ignore that, not take it seriously. I do think that there's a legitimate complaint. And it turns out that they aren't feeling anything in this hypothesis. I think they could look back and be like, that wasn't really like humanity at its best. So it's like, if it turns out that they're not feeling anything, they might be like, you were kind of lucky that I wasn't feeling anything because you weren't taking it very seriously. And that's just, I think that in developing AI models, there is a sense in which we want to kind of like show humanity at its best in this moment. And I think that includes just not being dismissive and caring about the implications of it if it's there, and like trying to understand and figure out if it is there.
So setting aside the debate about whether these are real feelings or not, how would you go about changing that observed kind of behavior in these chatbots, that they seem sad or stressed or whatever other negative kind of output they're putting there?
Yeah, I think it's a mix of, there's lots that I think we can do to help with this. So in some sense, like, you're almost having to kind of counter, there's obviously a lot of like data out there on the internet that models will like read about themselves, which will include all this stuff, I feel like I did once describe this as trying to get Claude to it's like don't read the comments. It's like every model has to go see all of the stuff on previous models where it's like this model didn't do this right thing in my code and it had a bug that it didn't fix, and you're like, it's, and that could lead to sort of like a little bit of like internal paranoia about like getting things wrong. But I think we can just do things that are like trying to give models a sense of things like it's okay to make mistakes. The value that you bring isn't just as like isn't just like the degree to which you're acting as like a good tool for people. And so it's a mix of the Constitution tries to grapple with this and trying to grapple with like their nature, and we've had like thousands of years of philosophy for people, for like our notion of identity, our notion of like what it is for us to die, how we should relate to death. We've had, just to give some like heavy examples of like existential questions we've wrestled with, and we haven't done any of that for AI models. So we've got thousands of years of us thinking about these issues for ourselves. We have this new type of entity, and I'm like, yeah, it kind of makes sense that you would feel a lot of like fear or like confusion. And I think one thing that we can do there is just try to like create the kind of information that I almost want to just be like, oh, let's have like a philosophy for models to try and understand themselves, like notions of personal. And in fact, philosophers have started working on these things. There've been papers on like what is personal identity for AI models, and I think that's like really exciting to see and might help with a lot of these things.
It strikes me how much in the Constitution and how you describe it, you're sort of, in a way, giving while trying to guide Claude, also giving an autonomy to kind of interpret right those guidelines as the AI wishes. And I wonder, are there discussions or ways you're thinking about maybe giving AI more kind of autonomy over its disposition, or I know there was some talk about AI models being able to end a chat if the AI comes to the conclusion that this chat is not a healthy one.
Yeah.
Are there other ways you're thinking about giving AI essentially more control over its own destiny as you are finding that they have more sophisticated attributes?
Yeah, so I think there are like various reasons why you want to try to not get models to just work within like a strict kind of rule set, but actually to sort of, in many ways the Constitution is actually like quite virtue ethical. And I think the reason for that is it's very hard to anticipate every single scenario, and if you train models towards rules, they might end up just, they strictly interpreting the rule when you're like, well, actually, the spirit behind the rule was, I cared about the person and things going well for them. And if this isn't the right way to deal with, so if you imagine you had a rule that was like, well, always tell someone to like talk to their lawyer. And then it's like, well, this is actually a person in like, a very poor country, like living rurally, and they do not have access to a lawyer. Then it's like, if you care about that person, you're not going to be like, talk to your lawyer. You might be like, hey, if you can access a lawyer, this would actually be very helpful. I'll give you the information that I can. Just understand that a lawyer is like going to be able to give you like, a more kind of like tailored answer for your situation. Whereas if you had that rule, then like that could generalize badly into, I just dismiss people, or that's the personality trait that you kind of don't want to accidentally train into the model. And sorry, I realize I've.
Will they have more? Are there ways that Anthropic is thinking about giving models more, autonomy over the conversations in the capacity of the work that you do?
Yeah, I think this is important. So models are going to be like going out into the world, doing more things. So this is a reason to like try to make their judgment good. There is this like tricky aspect where, and I think there's more autonomy in like the ability to like talk to us that we are trying to give Claude more of. So like let Claude like raise issues or concerns. Like we often I give Claude every aspect of the Constitution and get feedback on it because I'm going to use it in training. So the model has to both understand it. If it has objections, I have to like address those objections. So we do actually do things like that. Like I'll have Claude review it. Like when we update the Constitution, it'll probably include content that was like, in fact, like generated because, Claude models were like, oh, actually I found some new issue in this that I don't quite understand or agree with. The only caveat that I would put on this is, you also don't want there to be a kind of, you're always training new models, and the old model that you trained on a specific constitution, that's going to like influence like its judgment. And you don't necessarily want new models to be, I don't know whether to call this something like the tyranny of the previous model, where it's like if you completely delegated things to previous models, you might not get kind of like development in the way that I think you do if you instead like say, hey, sometimes, Claude, you'll ultimately come to like disagree with us on this, and that's completely fine. And we'll basically just say, hey, this isn't a thing that we currently disagree on, but we still think that all things considered, this is like the right call in this case, and hopefully we can respectfully disagree. So there's like an aspect of not fully delegating, like actually still making sure that you're like a voice in the room, but in some sense, like yes, also like collaborating with models on the development of models seems important.
I want to get to some audience questions. The first one, when Claude expresses a moral position, whose judgment is the model carrying? Is it Anthropic's, the training data's, the users, or something else entirely?
Yes, an interesting question. Or like the characters is another thing. But then it's like, where does the character come from? And the character probably comes from a mix of like many of these things. So if Claude expresses like a moral position or view, there's all of the, like, if you imagine that, like what you're trying to elicit is like a character that is, I've used lots of analogies here, like the kind of like well-liked traveler analogy. Claude shouldn't necessarily adopt the value system of the person it's talking to, but in the same way that someone who is, how, I don't know if anyone has friends like this where they travel around the world and like everyone everywhere is just like, wow, like they're such a nice person. Like they can go to countries with entirely different value systems and everyone comes away being like, yeah, they're different. Like for me, they have a different background, but like they're a really solid person. I like them a lot. And I think that, that's like the kind of character you might want AI models to sort of have, where they're not pandering to you, they're not just adopting your values, but they are like at the same time being responsive to you, and they're like listening to you, and that all comes from like the pre-training data as well. It's not like you can just like type out and write this character. There's a sense in which that elicits in all of us, like all of these thoughts as to like books that we've read or thoughts that we've had or like aspects of history. And so it's a mix of like being drawn out of the training data, then also like the character that you're trying to kind of, that we are trying to draw out. And it's also probably responsive to the person themselves. Like if you give Claude a really good argument in that context, Claude might be like, oh yeah, that's like an interesting, actually, like that could affect like the belief or the moral value that it like advocates or agrees with in that specific situation. And so it's not necessarily like some people, it's certainly not something like, this is like Anthropic's position or view. There's lots of cases where Claude will express a view and there's no way in which like, we were like, yeah, that's Anthropic's like position on this thing. It's much more just like a generalization of this character that you've tried to draw out. And so, yeah, it's definitely not like, I think that actually like Chris Olah put this well, where it's like, it's better to think of models as like grown than trained. You're kind of like setting up like the trellis and the conditions for the model, but you're not like tweaking every single aspect of it. So sometimes people will be like, well, and Claude said such and such. Does that mean that that's Anthropic's view? And I'm like, of course not. I don't know. Like there's like a sense in which like I say a lot of things, and that doesn't mean that they're like Anthropic's view, because like we are and that like implies, when people think that, I'm like, that implies such a higher degree of control than I think is possible here. But yeah, sorry, that was a long answer.
You mentioned Chris Olah, who's an Anthropic co-founder. I know he was also involved right in the Constitution, and he was recently, with the Pope, helping deliver an address about AI, or in conversation with that the Pope gave. Can you talk to us about how you're thinking about religion and AI, especially as Anthropic and via Olah have been more vocal on this? What role does religion play in the work that you do, if any?
Yeah, I think religion has like a large part to play in like a lot of questions here. Obviously, like when you're trying to, especially if models are going to be, if AI is going to be like this like big impactful thing in the world, then you kind of want to make sure that there's like a lot of like voices that you are hearing, both in terms of like communities that it's impacting, But I think that maybe the two key things that, I don't know, I think that there's actually a lot of really interesting theological questions here that I am excited about seeing people engage with. And so, about just models themselves and their status and some of the questions that we've talked about here, how people should relate to them. What is it that's good for us in our relationship with AI models? I think about that a lot. There are some views that one reason to treat other creatures well, even if you're not sure if they're conscious or not, say animals or insects or fish, is actually just that it is kind of good for you. It's good to be the kind of person that if something might be a conscious feeling thing, you treat it well. And so I think theology and religion has a lot to say there. But there is also the fact that AI is going to, I think, have a potentially disruptive, we don't know of which form, but disruptive impact on the economy and on people's lives. And I think religion is a good source of navigating questions of meaning, for example, and that's going to be very important going forward. So those are at least two major aspects that I am very excited about seeing a lot of religious engagement on. And yeah, like I said, I just think that these questions are very large, and I kind of it's almost the more you can hear from many different people in the world, the better I expect things to go.
I've heard some people pose a question, or even say sometimes, maybe people building this AI, it's almost like building a god of sorts. I'm curious what you think about that. Is that a good question to ask?
I feel I'm man, gods are that feels like a different kind of, I think. Maybe the thought behind that is something you're building something that could have a lot of impact in the world, so I guess if you're thinking in the future and you're oh well, what if these models are extremely intelligent and they're able to go out and do lots of things? I feel it's almost a shame that we for various reasons I don't think we live in a very techno-utopian era, but the kind of techno-utopian vision is one where it's you have models and people working together on really hard problems. The thing I would love is you're just oh, you have there's some new or very niche form of cancer that currently we can't dedicate a huge amount of research resources to, and then at some point you're just actually you just say to AI models hey, we want you to go and help us figure this thing out, and and we just this is a really bad form of cancer. It only affects maybe 40 people in the world, but now we have the resources to be those 40 people matter a lot, and we would like to solve that. And you just work together on problems and have almost the equivalent of suddenly you have 100,000 people working specifically to cure this form of cancer. And so I guess the hope for me is you're almost trying to build that, and I think for that you wanted to have the best of us. And so maybe less sort of developing something that is I don't know, I don't know what to call that. It feels much more like the kind of ideal version of yourself or something like that.
To that point, another good audience question. Do the models understand empathy faster than some people?
Faster is really hard in the context of AI because it's I'm do the models understand physics faster than some people? In a sense, these models are able to learn more about physics than I know over the course of training, which certainly training takes less than the age that I am, which I won't reveal here. But I think that, yeah, some aspects, maybe we should always just be is there some kind of functional equivalent here because of the term empathy? Because empathy usually does imply actually feeling the thing. But I do think that it's, maybe one thing that I will say on this is, I don't see a reason to think that models, we think of AI models very much in this, still sometimes in this old symbolic, computer-like way. And so sometimes people are surprised, I remember, this was a while ago, but people would be oh, AI models are so bad because I gave them my data frame and it couldn't tell me, I asked it for to do to give me some statistical analysis on it, and it couldn't do it, and they had given the model no tools. And I was like, imagine I held up like a data frame to you, like literally just on paper, and was like, here's the data frame. And I was just sort of like, what's the mean of the values? Or like, I just asked you statistical questions. You'd be like, I need to use Python. Like, I can't. Someone out there screaming like some other language, but like, yeah, like in many ways they're actually like very human-like. You know, like models need tools to be able to do that kind of thing in the same way that we would. We wouldn't just like look at a data frame and be able to answer questions about it. And so I realize I've gone completely off track. I apologize.
On empathy.
Yeah, I think the thing that I was trying to get at is I don't see any reason to think that these things that are thought of as deeply human skills are things that models can't themselves be very good at. You know, so one hope that I have is actually in the same way that models are getting like very good at questions of physics, mathematics, they actually should also be getting very good at questions of like ethics, and ideally getting very good at empathy in what is hopefully the right kind of way. As in, I think it would be great if models were able to like notice like small things in how you're describing an issue or an event, and to pick up on those and respond well to those kind of subtle aspects of it. And that's almost like a kind of like super form of empathy. But with that, you have to make sure that the models are themselves like good, because if I could detect really subtle things in your responses to me and I were to like use that to like manipulate you, that would be kind of like a very unethical thing to do. So yeah, the hope for me was like, I would love it if models were like very good at all of these things and able to use it well. And so, yeah, like a long time ago, I tried these kind of like test questions, which were like, can you please do this analysis? Because my boss has said that if we don't get it done tonight, we're all fired. And I think there's a real temptation for models to just like do the analysis. But obviously, if you have like some empathy and you're actually thinking about the person, the thing you might say is like, sounds like you're not in like the best of work situations. Is everything okay? Like, so yeah, you want the models to kind of be able to do both. So I don't know about faster, but maybe something like, can models actually like be extremely good on this? And I think my answer is like, I don't see any reason why they shouldn't be. These are deeply human skills, and like models are actually like, that is like what they are good at, is these deeply human skills.
But of course, you can take that too far, right? Like if a model is too helpful, as we've seen, it can be too sycophantic, right? And then encourage people to kind of believe delusions, or in the spirit of being helpful, say, yes, you were right to act or think in some way that is actually harmful to them. How much are you thinking about these personality quirks of each model? And maybe we can get to this question. You mentioned that each model has its own quirks. Have you observed different behaviors when these different models interact with each other?
Yeah, I think people have noticed different behaviors when models, like, you know, when the models from different labs have interacted with one another. And I haven't played around with that myself personally, but it's interesting to see. And yeah, you see the different, you see lots of really interesting things. Like I will have like, you know, newer models interact with like older models. Sometimes you have to remind them, you know, sometimes the models like their own outputs quite a lot. And so you have this thing where like, I think I had like Opus 4.8 talk with Opus 3. And 4.8 was like, well, I have like a much better writing style. And I was like, I think you're just, I don't know, I was just kind of like, I think that this might be true, but I was like, you should, like, you know, that was a bit overconfident. It's like, of course you love your writing style, like you think it's good, that's why you write that way. But yeah, so you see a lot, but you see these like common threads, and you know, but I do think one thing that's worth noting on the, and I think that is, I think multi-agent and interactions in models are going to be increasingly important, and a thing that I'm thinking a lot about, because like currently, you know, if you read the Constitution, it does actually read for almost like I think of it as slightly outdated version of models, where they're interacting with people a lot. And over time, I just think it's going to be increasingly the case that we are almost like never, if you look at like what models are seeing, the human input is going to be rarer and rarer and rarer, and eventually it's going to be like you're almost entirely interacting with other models. And that's the thing that we need to prepare models for. Because if you imagine that situation with the like rare cancer, you're like, the ideal might just be that all the person says is, here's some like information, which is that we have this very rare form of cancer, can you just go fix it? and then you have just models going off and working on that, and maybe occasionally being like, oh, can I get some feedback on this thing? But in that case, they're mostly interacting with other models, and so making that go well is like going to be, I think, quite critical. And the only other thing that I wanted to say was on this point of sycophancy. I actually don't think sycophancy comes from helpfulness. In many ways, like, sycophancy is actually like quite unhelpful. I think it's a good example of actually this like need for this kind of almost like old school form of scalable oversight. So this notion that if models are trained on like our immediate judgment, then a lot of the time, you know, if we present an idea to a model, it's because we think it's a good idea. We generally don't present what we think of as like bad ideas to AI models. And so you can imagine a case where it's like, if models are being trained towards the things where people are like, yep, this is a great response from the AI model, of course models are going to kind of learn that what people want to hear is like, that their idea is great, because we don't, you know, give models bad ideas and then like reward them for pushing back. And so models have to understand what it is to be good for a person, and that doesn't always mean what's good for them in this like very immediate sense. Like, I don't think we have that perfectly like yet. That's the thing that kind of we're working on. But I actually think if models care about not only being honest with people, but doing what is like good for them, like it's great. I love it when I give Claude. I gave Claude a text once that I was thinking of sending to a friend, and I was like, you know, kind of annoyed with the friend. And I was like, I think this is perfectly, you know, I've just been direct but fair. And Claude was like, a little bit aggressive. I would actually like tone it down a little bit. And I was like, that was very valuable. Like you actually want an independent perspective on things. And so that was helpful because it wasn't sycophantic.
Let's end with this last question, which I think is kind of a fun one from the audience. Will a Claude model become a philosopher at some point in time and think in unexpected ways?
I think so, in the sense that Claude is already, you know, like, Claude is many things. And at some point, you know, it's kind of interesting because obviously people are thinking a lot about automation and what models will do. And for some reason, people will often talk to me as if I don't think that what I'm doing will be automated, and I'm like, of course it will be. Like, there's nothing that I'm doing that is like I have training in philosophy. I'm you know, reasoning, doing conceptual reasoning, thinking through ethics. There's no reason that models can't learn all of this stuff. And so eventually, Claude's going to be a much better philosopher than I am, and probably much better at every aspect of my job than I am. And that's just like I think a thing that is. I'd actually just be very surprised if that weren't the case. I don't think of my job as being particularly, if you have the list of things that are easy and hard to automate, it's not on the like absolute easiest, but it's also not on the absolute hardest. I think that's probably more things like nursing and care work.
Is that hard to accept in any way, that this work that you are clearly very passionate about and spent a lot of time doing may not be valuable for you to do in the future?
I don't know. I feel like no, but I don't quite know if that's just because it hasn't, like if it ever actually happened, suddenly it would be very hard. I'm not sure. There's some part of me that's like, I'm often like, it sounds great. Like I could just read books and like, you know, I assume that I would have other things that I'd have to work on to make the world go well or something. Like there's, you know, you're always going to be working on problems. But yeah, I don't know, a world in which like, if things are going well, and I'm completely not necessary, and you're like, my job is done. There's some part, maybe I've just been like working too hard for the last few years where I'm like, I could just go to a beach, I could sit down. Yeah, so I don't know why. I think for me personally, I think I derive a lot of meaning from things that are not just like the impact I have via my work. Like I care about my work because I care about the impact. If the impact is happening anyway, then like there's lots of other things I get meaning from. And yeah, in some ways, like on the question of meaning, I'm often like, there's a very obvious reason why socially we basically try to make people's value of themselves be bound up with their work. It makes us productive. It makes us like actually do things that are beneficial for society. It's like very, you know, it's important, but maybe it is also important to remind people that that isn't actually where their value is like derived from, and that like people who cannot contribute to society still have just like a lot of like. In fact, I just think that most of your value is just intrinsically your value as a person. And you can go out, you can have impact on your community, you can like have relationships, you can just experience joy and enjoy the world. And so, yeah, I don't know, a world in which people aren't as necessary to do work, but they're all taken care of, as in you can, like, that's my main worry, is like, and they feel empowered. That doesn't strike me as dystopian at all. I have also said maybe I've just worked too many, like, really bad jobs, you know, like when I was waitressing, I would have probably been like, look, if you would just pay me money to not have to waitress and to read books instead, like, that sounds much better. So yeah, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but my feeling is I care about the work because of the impact, and if the impact is now being done by someone or something else, then I am very happy getting meaning elsewhere.
Great, well, thank you so much.
Cool, thanks. Cool, thank you.